Hello and welcome to Missy's Imaginings. It is about 4 o'clock in the morning and we are dealing with icy weather, so we cannot drive on the road this morning. Yesterday we were stuck in, the roads were all icy and frozen over. Then last night, well, all through yesterday afternoon and through the night we had light rains, so the temperature is again down to 29 degrees. So it is just a fresh layer of ice on the roads, and so we are stuck for a little bit. And so I got up this morning, checked the roads, and we won't be driving in this morning. And so in the meantime, while we're waiting for a possible thaw later in the day, I thought, let's go ahead and use our time, because this weekend I rested a lot, and so now we're going to go ahead and work on our project. So we're working on the Professor Snape project, and we are going to be working on the Faceup this morning, and then also the shirt. So I have the shirt pattern here. We're going to take a look at the pieces, and then just a quick note on this project, I probably won't show sewing the pants, because, we'll put a little thing here, I've sewn lots and lots of pants here on the channel. They're going to be pretty much the same as a lot of the other pants. No real big changes, just a basic pair of trousers. I'm not making them real fancy because they're going to be underneath a coat and underneath a cloak, so I just want his legs to have pants on. So we'll put the pants aside there, and we'll take a look at the shirt. Now, while this shirt is similar to a lot of other patterns on the website, this one I did change up for this project. I'm still not sure if this pattern will be available. There are a few patterns that I make that are like Missy exclusive. They're some of my patterns that I kind of keep to myself, so I'm not sure yet if this will be one of those patterns, but you're free to make alterations to any of the myriad of shirt patterns that are already on the channel and on the website, because you're going to be able to see how to sew them. So first we have a shirt collar, pretty basic. It does have the pointed tips on the shirt, and so here we have our collar. Then a sleeve, which is noticeably wider at the cuff and over the shoulder, because this sleeve will be gathered at the top. So it is a little bit wider than some of the other sleeves, just because it will be intentionally gathered at the shoulder as well as at the cuff. This shirt will be a yoked shirt, so here we can see that the bottom part of the shirt front is longer than the yoke because it will be gathered to fit the yoke. So there will be some gathers here. That will happen on the back yoke as well. So I've made the shirt back wider than the yoke because it will be gathered to fit the yoke. You can also pleat. If you want the pleat, you can pleat to match, and I do have that method on other shirts on the website, so you can pleat it to fit the yoke, but this one will be gathered. So we have those pieces. Then we have the facing for the front, the facing for the back. Then I was originally just going to have the cuff flare out at the cuffs, where the cuff would connect on the closure. But then I thought, well, I would kind of like the whole cuff to flare out a little bit, so I did an alternate shape for my project, and I'm going to have it actually curved, so then as this line is straightened onto the bottom of the shirt sleeve, you can see how that will flare out, because once that's straightened, it creates the flare on the cuff. So we will be doing that. And because this has a curved edge to make it flare, instead of cutting one cuff, and then just folding it for the edge of the cuff. We are actually going to have to cut 2 pieces for each cuff and sew this top edge because it's flared, so it's no longer straight, so you can't just fold it. So that's the change in the cuff and the gathers. So that's what we're going to be doing for the shirt. And so yeah, so the next step is to go ahead and get it cut out. with all the pieces now cut, we're going to start our assembly with what I like to call as just pre-sewing or prep sewing. And I mean, it's all just part of the sewing process, but if you've been to the channel, you know that I like to get some of my parts pre-assembled in a certain order so that I'm ready to just put the shirt together once all the pieces are completed. So first is the collar, which I will sew with right sides together, up one side, across the top edge, and down the other side. Then I will trim away excess seam allowance and then flip it right side out. Everything's going to have a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then on my shirt front pieces, we have the lower front and the yoke. So we will be gathering this top edge to fit the yoke. And let's see, oh, that's an arm. So it goes like this. So we will be gathering this to fit the yoke. And then also on all these edges where I am putting the two pieces together to assemble, I will gather it, sew it, then I will do an overlock stitch with an overlock / serger machine to finish off that raw edge inside so that it will be nice and finished on the outside. Then I will probably take the seam allowance up towards the yoke and then top stitch on the edge of the yoke to complete the front. So I will be doing that to the fronts of the shirt so that my front pieces will be totally assembled. Then the same thing on the back. I'll gather that top edge to meet the yoke, then I will overlock it and then top stitch. And this is a white on white print. So let's see if we can kind of get it to show. I think that'll kind of show. You can tell it's not just a flat white fabric. Then on the sleeves, I will be putting a double basted stitch across the top that will let me gather the top, which I'll do for all my gathering actually. Then I will gather the cuff edge and fit it to the smaller curve of my cuffs with right sides together. Then after I have the cuff on the edge of the shirt and it's sewn on the shirt, then I will add the second cuff in order to flip it. But I want to go ahead and get it on the shirt first, because if I sew this to the other cuff, then I'm just going to have a flap of fabric that will get in the way, and it will make it difficult to get all that fitted and put together. So I'm going to put the facing of the cuff on after it's already sewn to the sleeve. And I won't need to finish the edge of this fabric because it will be hidden inside the facing of the cuff. So that will be a little bit different than normal, but I will be serging or overlocking from about halfway on the sleeve up towards the edge, so that when this fabric is turned in at the closure, then that overlocked or serged edge will naturally fold in to give me a nice finished edge on the edge of my closure for the wrist openings. So I have that work to do on the sleeve. Then on the facing, I will be sewing the facings together so that the back facing is attached to the front facing at the shoulder seam. So that's all my prep work that I need to do, or my pre-sewing, and then once all those pieces are assembled, then we will start putting the actual shirt together. Oh, and then I will of course serge or overlock around the entire edge of the facing, because that will be visible inside the finished garment. So there we go. There's our starting point. Just a small little note, as I'm doing a lot of my prep sewing, I'm going to be gathering this edge, so I have my 2 rows of basting, and I'm going to be fitting it to the cuff. So a lot of times, to make sure I have things centered correctly, I'll just fold my fabric in half and put a small notch here so I don't cut where I need my threads to go. but just enough to mark the center of that piece as well as on the cuff right there. So that way, once the gathers are in place, I can match up the ends of my pieces and then also match up the center so that everything lines up correctly and I don't have the gathers like really offside to, you know, make it kind of crooked. So a lot of times I'll do that before I start fitting the pieces together just to make sure my centers match. Let's take a look at where we are. So we have the facing sewn together at the shoulders, and I pressed the seam allowances open, then did the overlock stitch all the way around the edge, so that's nice and finished. Then on the shirt we have the gathered piece fitted to the yoke, and the seam allowance was also overlock stitched and then top stitched up towards the yoke. So there's the fronts of the shirt right here and the back. So here's what it looks like on the good side. So all those are done. Now the shirt pieces will be put together with right sides together at the shoulders, and then the shoulder seams on the shirt will be pressed open as well, just like on the facing. And then once that is done, we'll be ready to put in the collar when we attach the facing. So that will be the next part that we need to do to assemble the shirt body here. And here's the facing. That'll all go together with the collar. On this collar, I chose not to top stitch around the edge. I just want it to be just a nice pressed edge on the collar. I've also notched the centerpiece, and then I've also cut little notches right to this stay stitching. The stay stitching is inside what will be the seam allowance, and then I just notched about every 1/4 inch so that that will allow the collar to fit more easily into the neck opening on the shirt when I have to fit it in there. Just gives a little more flexibility there. Now on our sleeves, we have done the same thing, only I'm not going to top stitch on the cuff edge. So that will not have top stitching there. But I did take the edges of the sleeve a little, oh, was that about 3 inches? Let's look here. Yes, right at 3 inches up from the edge of the cuff. And I went ahead and slid the edge into the serger machine and then did a couple stitches and then swept the tail over to the side and included it in the stitching so that this is a nice finished edge, just about this much of the sleeve. The reason being that this edge of the fabric is going to end up naturally folding in like this, so that this is what you will see from the outside, but on the inside this will show and it will be all nice and finished. This part up here where I started that seam will be inside the seam allowance, so I won't have to worry about that. But this is just a way to ensure that the cuff opening on the sleeve above the cuff will have a nice finished surface. So that's why I do those edges. You can always zigzag that if you don't have a serger or overlock machine. So I've done that on all the edges of the sleeves. So when I put the cuff in, I'm going to pre-iron this edge so that my raw edge is the nice right side of the fabric, and just fold it in, and I may go ahead and snip so I can more easily press, because it will be folded out later, but just to help me out, I'm just going to snip this edge just a little bit, and then I'm going to iron and press that, what would be a seam allowance. I'm going to press it under like so. Then I'm going to have this edge pressed upwards, and I'm going to sew over that seam allowance, up the cuff, across all that curvature, and then back down this side of the cuff with that seam allowance turned up, so that when I flip that to right side out on the inside, then when it's sewn, this seam allowance will already be naturally turned up, and I can then just stitch the edge in place to hide the seam allowance where it's connected to the sleeve. So that's my next step in putting the cuff facing onto the sleeves, so that the sleeves will be all finished and ready to assemble to the shirt. Now we have the facing of the cuff sewn on, and I'm not going to trim away on the sides, but I am going to trim away just at an angle to the corner of the cuff, and then I'm going to trim along the outer edge seam allowance just to reduce the bulk there, and then again here cut at an angle, because all that's going to be inside my cuff, and I just want to reduce the bulk at the tips there. So now I'm going to fold the cuff seam allowance towards the inside of the sleeve, and then flip that cuff out, and I will have my tweezers here that I can push that corner out a little bit, and then I'll do the same here. I'm going to fold that seam allowance towards the inside of the sleeve, and then flip that corner, and then use my tweezers to punch that little, if I can get it, the little tip of that corner out. There we go. And now we can press this seam so that we have our seam pulled all the way out. We'll press that flat, and now this edge that's already been turned under naturally will just be slip stitched in place, so that this will be all nice and finished on the inside, like so. And then this, as you can see, now naturally turns the edge of that sleeve into the inside of the sleeve. So now we have, dun dun dun, we have the gathered sleeve with a flared cuff ready to go. So there we go. It does need to be pressed, but that's how I finish out this sleeve. And then of course this will overlap because we'll have a snap closure, but then it allows for the look of the cuff that I wanted, that will be on the outside of the shirt. Instead of just straight, it does have a little bit more of a flare to it, which is what I wanted. So there we go. So that's how we do this kind of a cuff. So yeah, we'll do the shoulders on the body of the shirt, and then the sleeves will be all done. So it'll just be getting the collar and the facing put in, then put the sleeves on. my shoulders together and pressed open. I've also done something that I just would like to recommend, and I'm not sure if it will show on the camera, but I've actually done stay stitching all the way around the neckline, and then I've snipped to that stay stitching and actually cut a whole notch here at the center back. And the stay stitching is actually a very valuable tool because it gives kind of an edge against which you're going to pull, and it just helps, especially if you have a fabric that will fray, it just helps give a solid line where your actual seam is going to be, because when we add the collar and the facing, we're going to try to fool the machine and think that we're sewing a straight line. And to be able to pull that straight and feed it through the machine a little more easily, it really helps to have that stay stitching to just give that edge against what everything's going to pull. And then you have a direction to how far you're going to snip into that seam allowance. So it's just a really valuable tool to take the time to stay stitch around that neckline. And it's just a single line of stitch. It's not holding anything together per se, so I do cut the tails right at the edge of the fabric. You don't need to have any of the tails left, but it just makes it a lot easier if you're tugging and pulling and trying to line things up, to have that line of stay stitching along the neckline. So I've done it on the body of the shirt as well as on the shirt facing. So I also have that stay stitching, and I've also snipped that seam allowance on the facing. So now to put the collar in and to put in the facing, and you can do it either way. Oh, hit my camera here. If you like, you can go ahead and I always start with the center back of the collar, and I'm going to pin that in, and I've cut my notch at my center back, so I'm just placing my pin like right next to it here, because I can't go very deep. Now I'm going to work that along the edge and then pin that in place. What's really important is that you make sure that the seam allowance on the collar is up flush with the seam allowance of the shirt. It's really easy for this to pull down, and if that happens when you sew, what can happen is you can have the edge of your collar sticking out of your seam. So it's really important that when you're putting the collar in to the shirt body, and you just kind of work, I like to work from the center out, because that way I can ensure that my collar is centered in the neck opening and not crooked on one side. And still I'll verify, so I'm going to pin to one side here, and then I'm going to make sure that my raw edge is flush up at the top. Put my pin in to hold it in place, keeping that raw edge up. Then I'll pin this direction and work that. And since I'm kind of pulling that along the neckline, that stay stitching really does help. Get another pin. I kind of have a bad thumb these days that doesn't want to grip very well, so there we go. I'm putting off the necessary surgery for this hand just because insurance demands a pretty high deductible these days. We kind of had a change in our insurance plan last year, so my poor little thumb is biding its time to where I have enough to cover the the deductibles on all that stuff. All right, so now I want to see, do I have the same amount on this end as this end? So I'm going to line up my collar and then line up my shirt, and my shirt lines up when I line up my collar. So I'm happy with where my collar is placed. I think this side I could pull a little bit more snug, probably right here. Yeah, just kind of even that out a little bit better. There we go. And then this one would be a little more taut here. There we go. And I like that better. It's probably only a millimeter difference, but I like that. So now, with the collar in place, I'm going to check and make sure my pins have not pleated my fabric anywhere or gotten caught in any weird position. That looks pretty good. Okay. And now I can go ahead and sandwich. Oh, I was going to say, if you want, you can baste the collar in place first, which we could do that. And then we'll put the facing in. The other note I was going to make is when you're snipping the edges, I like to make sure that my shoulder seam right here has a snip like 1/8 of an inch about on each side of it, because if you snip way back here and way back here but not close to that seam, then it's hard to pull that straight, because that is the tightest curve on the neckline is right at the shoulder seam. So I like to snip really close to that seam on either side just to make sure that straightens out easier. All right, so we're going to go ahead and feed this through the machine. And I like to sew it with the collar down, because then as I'm sewing, I can make sure that my shirt is pulled away from the seam so I don't catch any of that fabric in my seam and then end up with a pleat. So we're going to put this into the machine, and I'm just starting at the very edge of the fabric, not the edge of the collar. I'm going to start right at the fabric edge so I'm catching everything. And I will do a back tack. And then we're going to start sewing. And what I'm doing is, instead of trying to sew around the curve, around the curve of a neckline, see how I've pulled this all to make it look like the machine thinks I'm sewing a straight line. And I'm just taking all those gentle folds of fabric that form because I'm going around a curve and pull them away from the seam. Move my pins here. And then we're going to make sure that my seam allowance is still up flush. And don't try to go fast, just go slow. And I'm adjusting my fabric as I go. Take that pin out. Making sure my fabric doesn't buckle. See how this wants to come up? I don't know if that will... Let's see if we can adjust. Whoa. Come down. And I'm going to adjust here. Let's see if this will catch what I'm trying to show. Right here, there's a little bump in the fabric, and what can happen is that can go up above your seam, and if you sew over it, then you've got a big pleat. So that's why I'm gently going to pull that away from my seam and then adjust as I go, because I don't want a seam there. But when you tug it out of the way, you still have to be careful that you're not pulling the seam allowance down too far. So you just want to make sure that all those folds are not caught in your seam. I'm lifting my foot a little bit to adjust. And remove a pin. again, I'm going to pull this pin out and adjust. And adjust here, making sure my collar is up flush. And then I'm going to sew all the way to the end of my fabric. Quick little back tack just to anchor that thread. Alright, now let's pull it out of the machine and we'll take a look. So we want to make sure that we didn't have any pleats in our fabric. Nope, no pleats there. And then we'll look at the back and see how that fit in. And there we go. So now we have gone all the way around. So this was a little bunch, but that's a seam allowance, so that'll be okay. And there we have it. So now that we have the collar in place and we know it's not going to slip, we're going to sandwich the collar between the right sides of the shirt and the right side of the facing. And again, I'm going to start with the center back and I'll pin my facing in place just like we did before with the collar. And then I'll work my way out to the edge of the fabric, making sure that's all even. Pin that, but then I'm also going to pin all the way down the front. And when I sew, I'm going to sew the hem all the way up the front, around the neckline, down the other front, and then the hem. So I'm going to do all that to insert the facing into the shirt. Okay, so here is where I do need to go a little bit deeper here because I can see the stay stitching on my collar edge. So the raw edge of the collar is all tucked in, but I need to go a little deeper to cover that bit. So I'm going to unfold this and I'm going to take my seam just a little bit deeper here to make sure that I cover up that stay stitching. I know I don't have any pleats to worry about, but I will make that little bit of a correction. So I go a little bit deeper over the edge of my collar, and then that will hide that stitching on the collar. And that did the trick. So now we don't have any of that stitching showing on my finished collar. So very happy with how this all turned out. We don't have any pleats. Now we have everything all hidden as far as our raw edges inside where the collar is. And this collar will stand up as well. Then we have our shoulders, all look nice, no pleats. So now we're ready to put in the sleeves. So this part will be to take the sleeves, and I have basted 2 rows of basting across the top seam allowance. I'll grab my gathers, and I always gather with my right side thread. It's just my preference. So I'm going to take and separate my threads here, so I can separate the top threads from the bobbin threads. And they want to get a little bit tangled. I'm not sure why. Okay, there we go. And I'll gather this edge. So I'm going to gather this top edge by pulling on those basting tails. So we're going to even out those ruffles and gathers on the sleeve. And let me grab those again. I kind of let go of them, and now there we go. So I'm going to have a bunch of gathering right up on the shoulder, and I just kind of want to even those out. I did put a notch in the center of the sleeve so I know where my shoulder seam will meet. So now my next step is I'm going to put the sleeve right side to right side with the shirt. I'm going to start at the outside of the arm, and I will also be stay stitching along the arm and then snipping these curves here. But I'm going to start pinning from the outside edge of my sleeve, and then the outside edge on this side, and work my way to the center, and then just loosen the gathers enough to where I can fit the sleeve into that opening, but I want all remaining gathers to be up by the top of the shoulder. So that's how I'm going to fit the sleeve into this place in the shirt, is just by working my way up from one side and then working it up on the other side, so that any of the gathers will be gathered together up at the shoulder, and making sure that notch is at the shoulder seam. And that way all my gathers are placed up at the top, and I don't end up with gathers on my sleeve under the armpits, because you don't want that. You want all the gathers to be up at the top of the shoulder, but then you might have to pull some of that loose in order to fit it into the arm opening. So I'm going to do that and then sew, and then I will use the overlock serger machine to finish this edge, because that will be visible inside the finished garment. So I will do that to get both the sleeves into the shirt. This is where we are so far on the shirt. So we have the facing in, the facing shoulder seam will be sewn, just tacked on the edge of the shirt shoulder seam to hold that facing in place. So I'll have to tack that in on each of the shoulders. There we go. And so that'll keep the facing tucked up properly. Then the next step I'm going to do is to sew the sleeves up to the arm, underarm, and then down the side. So we're going to turn the shirt inside out, and this is where all that pre-sewing comes into play. So now I'm going to match up my cuffs and this fabric, and I'm going to come down from the edge of the cuff about 2 inches. So we'll measure here. Yep, 2 inches. And I'm going to put my pin here, if I can get a hold of a pin. And this is where I'm going to start sewing my sleeve. So I'm not going to sew all the way to the cuff, because I want an opening so that I can get my hand in and out. So this will be open, and that's why all this was important, because then once my seam is sewn and the sleeve is done, then this will naturally turn like this, giving that nice finished edge that we wanted on the cuff opening. So we're going to come down 2 inches from the edge of the cuff. Then all of this will be inside that seam allowance. So then we'll come to the underarm, we'll pin that, then we'll pin down the sides, and then I'm going to sew from the end of the sleeve to the underarm and down the side on each side of the shirt. Here is the finished shirt except for the closures. So the sleeves are all done, it's all pressed. There we go, with the flared cuffs. So if we straighten out the edge, then that brings the flare up a little bit more. Then we have the yoked top and the yoked top of the back. We have the gathers and it's all hemmed. I just need to put the closures on. We have the facing tacked up at the shoulders and of course the little tag. So yes, all in all, I'm very happy with how this turned out. It's not as puffy as, say, for the Colonel Brandon character, but it could be easily adapted to add more width in the sleeve, just angle out the sides of the sleeve a little bit more. Even the width at the cuff could be a little bit more puffy, and then add more puff at the shoulder. There could be more puff added on the front very easily. But for the character of Professor Snape, I wanted this to be a little bit more puffy than just a typical men's dress shirt, just to kind of fit my idea of the vibe of the character and the costume, but not so puffy that it won't still fit inside the sleeves of the coat and inside the fitting of the coat. So it will have some fullness around where it's tucked in because of the gathering we've added, but that's kind of what I wanted for this character. So now that the shirt only needs the finishing touches, it just needs the snaps and the buttons put on and it will be all done. So now it's time to work on the face up for our Professor Snape.
Hi,
Now we'll take a look at the completed shirt. So I am very glad with how it turned out. And we have the yoke at the top, which gives just a nice line with 2 buttons above and on the yoke above that division. Then I finished it with, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 more buttons down, and I didn't put the 5th one just because it would be a little redundant and it would usually be tucked in anyway. The stand-up collar can be folded down, or it can do the bent tips, which will be nice under the cravat. So that is coming. And there's just enough puff in the sleeves to have the more full look that I wanted, but it will still fit in the jacket. Then the cuffs, and he is very floppy. This body is the Angel Studio 1/3 scale body, and I did have to wire his legs just because he's very heavy and very long, and so I did wire the legs, but right now he's strung pretty tight, so I could not put the wire from the shoulder wire, or the shoulder elastic, all the way down through his torso yet, because I didn't want to restring him this morning. But so here is the cuff, and he keeps wanting to tip, so so we did 1 button on the cuff, and then that gives a good flared cuff. It is longer in the front, and then it goes up on the side a little bit. We'll turn him around, and here's what it looks like in the back with the gathers on the yoke, and then it comes down, and then of course it'll be tucked in, but it gives more of a blousing effect here, which is what I wanted. And then on the arms it's nice and full. So yeah, there is the completed shirt with his face and his wig. So yes, he's coming along nicely. He does have a little bit of a rooster tail there. Coming along nicely. And so now we'll need to go ahead. These are just some black pants that I had from another project, so we're not gonna look at them because his trousers aren't actually done yet. But we finished the face up and the shirt, and I did have a black wig that's kind of long and stringy, which is of course what he needs. So the wig is done and his face up is done. So welcome, Professor Snape, to the household, and we will continue on our journey to next finish up the trousers and work on that fabulous coat. So thanks for coming, and I'll see you next time. Bye.